This episode, I'm joined once again by writer and occultist John Michael Greer to discuss the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, alongside general discussion on esoteric groups throughout history. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to keep the podcast running and support Hermitix, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, John Michael Greer, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
We are going to be discussing later, probably the half of this discussion will be around a group called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is probably the most well-known and the most influential esoteric order of modern occultism. Founded in, let me just get my dates right here.
1887.
1887, so 137 years ago now. 1887 by William Robert Woodman, William Wynne Westcott, and Samuel Liddell Mathers. And I don't want to dive too deep into the lineage and the origins of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn just yet, because that's typically esoterically tricky anyway. What I realized, because you mentioned this book, book by Alec Howe about the history of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and what I realized when reading it was there's this huge discussion and it's actually a huge sort of assumption, or maybe just something that is given, I think, in esotericism, and maybe even we could go as far as religions, but especially esotericism, there's something that's given, that for those that know the history is there the whole time, but possibly is just because it's a foundation, it isn't seen as a priority or a primary thing. And that's groups. That is people coming together, together as a community, under a leader, under a few leaders, under a teacher, under a guru. And I was thinking, you know what? Day one of the history of Western esotericism really is textual history. We have Pythagoras with his students. So from the beginning, really, we have groups. So
of course,
what is it about groups that is needed, that is natural for groups within esotericism for them to form, do you think?
Well, it seems very simple to me. We can start with Pythagoras as a great example. Here's this guy who went to Egypt from the Greek world, and managed to get his way into an Egyptian temple very late in the history of Egypt's independence, and learned a bunch of things that a lot of people in the Greek world did not know. And then after he finished his training, he returned to the Greek world, settled in Crotona, in the Greek colonial communities in what's now Italy, and said, oh, by the way, I have some stuff I'm willing to teach. So what happened? A bunch of people showed up to learn from him. That's where you get a group.
You think truth brings people together?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's truth, but it's it's curiosity, certainly. It's information. It's wanting to know something other than the sort of generic stuff you would get growing up in a Greek society or any other society. You know? The thing that esoteric traditions have to offer is something new, or maybe something old, but something unfamiliar. Okay, it's not just what you learned in Sunday school. And so, inevitably, you're going to end up, whether we're talking about Pythagoras, whether we're talking about Jesus of Nazareth, whether we're talking about William Wynne Westcott, or Dion Fortune, or anybody else. You have somebody with something to teach, something to offer, and other people are going to scramble over and say, ooh, can I sit and listen? Will you tell me what you know? Will you give me some instructions? Thus the group is born. And it's inevitable because, for the simple reason that there's a tendency in some aspects of modern pop culture occultism to claim, well, we already know, you already know deep in yourself all that you need to know. That is an excuse for fatal ignorance. Because no, you don't. No, you don't. There are people who know more than you do. There are people who've been doing this for a long time, who learn from people who've been doing this for a long time. There are traditions, there are teachings, there are systems, and you can learn them. You don't already know them, and you might actually benefit from them. And so, again, groups become essential. unless you want to do it entirely on a one-on-one basis, but that tends to be time intensive. So pretty soon, yes, you end up with Pythagoras or Dion Fortune or whoever's sitting there, with a circle of people gathered around going, "Ooh, now what was that?" There's your group.
It's interesting you mentioned Jesus of Nazareth there, and it's actually a fairly good example of the very, very early church, very, very early Christian church. This notion of the early catechesis, where there was a point where, if you were to run through it, there's a point in the Mass where everyone can attend. And then when you get to the point, this is obviously in very early Christianity, this isn't the case now, but there was a point when it goes, okay, we could say a quite literal Hermetic seal is put, and, you say, you guys haven't gone through the training, you haven't gone through catechesis, so you need to leave. And that was for the consumption of the host. So the question there I have is, what's in that difference between, the closing of the door, the only certain people are allowed, the difference between a group and an esoteric group?
Okay. And there you have, what you're asking about is the nature of initiation. Because I believe in at least some other documents, the Christians still refer to the process whereby a person comes to be baptized for the first time. An adult shows up at the church and says, "Hi, I want to become a Christian. What do I need to know?" As Christian initiation. And with the ceremony of baptism as the central initiatory rite, something you would find equivalence of all through the ancient world. The dependence of Christian tradition on the old mysteries is not small. But yeah, basically, if you've been through the initiation ritual, certainly in theory, and one hopes in practice, certain things have been transmitted to you, and I'm not talking about information. You get all the information. You go to your catechism classes. You learn the stuff you're supposed to learn. You undergo various other modes of preparation, and then there's a ceremony. And I know it's one of those things that our culture insists that all ceremonies are just empty forms, and there can't actually be anything real communicated. But that's simply the bigotries of our time. In point of fact, something is transmitted. If the person who practices the ceremony, who performs it for the other, actually knows what they're doing, if they have themselves the kind of connection to the spiritual that makes that possible, yeah, something is transmitted, something that is non-rational in nature, something that is trans-rational in nature, that adds a further dimension to the experience, and then you've gone from being on the outside to being on the inside, and setting things up so that only those on the inside can attend certain other ceremonies makes perfect sense in that context.
A sort of, maybe not a trick question, but a loaded question.
Good.
Is all initiation self-initiation?
No. Self-initiation is always necessary. I mean, if you let's imagine that you're going to be baptized, or let's imagine that you've applied to become a member of a lodge of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and you're gearing up to go through your neophyte grade. Okay, so there are certain preparations, and then you go through the ceremony, whether it's the baptism or the neophyte initiation. Then you have some work to do. And whether it's in the Christian context, whether it's a member of participating in the sacraments and in the sacramental life of the church, and you're doing the other things that one does when one is a Christian, or whether one, again, in the Golden Dawn, one is taking, studying the first knowledge lecture and, fumbling your way through your first repetitions of the lesser ritual, the pentagram, or what have you. There's work to do. If you do not do the work, the initiation doesn't matter. Sure, you get that transmission, but it won't stick. You actually have to work to get it to stay in place. Now, can you get to the same place without the ceremony? Yes. It's not as easy. The whole point of the ceremony is they're transmitting that influence to you, so that makes that gives you a real boost. But as I can't speak to baptism, I've never been baptized, but certainly in terms of the Golden Dawn system, I studied that for many years before I finally became a member of a Golden Dawn temple, and I did the necessary work to self-initiate in that tradition, and I found that when I became a member, it was not a matter of, wow, here's something completely new. It's, okay, I know this stuff. I feel this stuff. I have this energy. I've experienced this before in a more diffuse and less concentrated way, stretched out over the period of self-initiatory work that I did. So I'd say it's not true that all initiation is self-initiation. It is true that all initiation has to be combined with personal effort, and it is true that there's no place that you have to have the formal ceremony to get to. There are, if you're willing to do the work, you can get there by yourself.
So, what about? So, just to stay within this realm, just of groups generally, but we can focus in on the Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn. What? Just to maybe sum all this up so far, I think. What is it? And this probably will be a bit of repetition here. What is it that groups can achieve that individuals can't?
Very little, but we are social primates. We like to interact in groups. We like to hang around with, with other people who share our interests, who share our concerns. That's part of the kind of ape that we are. And you can do it yourself. It will be slower. It will take you a lot of personal work. You'll probably make a range of mistakes that you'll have to rectify over time. But certainly at this point, especially when basically all the relevant material has been published, you can do it all yourself. But it does get lonely. And for that reason, what you can get from groups it's not a matter of, you have to belong to X group. You have to join, this order to achieve the 16th level of transcendent, whatchamacallitness. It's simply that, A, you do get the advantage of hopefully competent instruction and mutual support with other practitioners. B, you get the other social benefits of hanging out with people who share interests with you. And it's a lot less lonely.
So let's talk about probably the most controversial aspect, I think, of groups, actually. Leaders, chiefs, gurus. What is the? And you've been an arch druid in your time. I
did 12 years as Grand Archdruid of the Grand Archdruid. Yes, that was not. I did not come up with that title. I thought it was rather silly, but that's the traditional title. Grand Archdruid of the Grand Grove of the Ancient Order of Druids in America, and that and $3.50 will get you a cup of coffee. Again, we're social primates. We like fancy titles. We like to, say I'm the Grand Pangendrum, or or what have you, and it's really rather silly.
Well, I don't know. I think there's something to be said for tradition. My question really was around what makes the notion of with regard to the Golden Dawn, a chief. The notion of it, let's just stick with chief or leader, is vital, I think, for a group. Otherwise, you end up ultimately usually in chaos. What's the difference between a good and a bad leader?
How many volumes of social psychology and leadership theory do you want to study? And and they'll still argue about what that. Well, we can simply know by practice. A good leader is one who can minimize the amount of quarreling and maximize the amount of work that can get done. And the Golden Dawn had a very mixed record with that. Dion Fortune's a great example. She was able to pull together a group, make it function, and keep it going at a fairly intense pace for her entire life. Most of her adult life, in fact, was spent as the head of her own magical lodge, and it accomplished a great deal. The Golden Dawn had its leadership of the three that you mentioned: Woodman, Westcott, and Mathers. Woodman was very elderly and didn't last long. Westcott, he was kind of edged out at a certain point, and Mathers was not a very good leader. He was very into his own, how incredibly important he was, and how everyone had to be loyal to him, and so he basically drove a rebellion against himself, and the Golden Dawn blew itself to smithereens. I mean, it was founded in 1887, collapsed irrevocably in 1903. That's not a very long history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, 15 years, 16 years maybe. That's as long as they were able to keep it together. And so Mathers was brilliant. He was a very capable occultist. He was a competent teacher. He wrote some things that are very well worth reading. But he wasn't good at managing the clash of egos in an organization like the Golden Dawn, and so it blew up.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty with the Golden Dawn, I mean, as the title of this recording will just probably be the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, why are we talking about them?
Well, I think you already settled that. It is far and away the most famous, most influential of modern occult organizations in the English-speaking world. In that 16 years of life, the Golden Dawn, the core members of the Golden Dawn, created what is still the most exhaustively complete system of ceremonial magic in existence, a system that even people who claim to be heavy-duty Golden Dawnies have rarely worked through in full. It appeared at the right time. Right as the Theosophical Society was really developing a market for public occultism in the Western world, and an enormous number of the influential esoteric groups in Britain and in the United States and in several other parts of the world came straight out of it. Whether we want to speak of Dion Fortune in the UK, whether you want to speak of Paul Foster Case over here, or any of half a dozen others in either place. It was enormously influential, and its offshoots, the people it inspired, whether for good or ill, whether we want to talk about Dion Fortune, whether we want to talk about Aleister Crowley, they made their mark. They unquestionably made their mark on the world, and and what all of these people learned from the Golden Dawn was a very important part of that.
Mm-hmm. So now we get into the it's sort of a classical trope, I think, with individual esotericists. I mean, we see it with Blavatsky, we see it with Gurdjieff has the same thing. He goes off and he says, I found all these scrolls in the desert. Well, where'd you find them exactly? Where? Or Blavatsky with the masters.
Oh, yes, where she's sitting there picking telepathic messages out from, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, or Rudolf Steiner with the Akashic record. It's very nice to have a sort of, I can just do this thing, no one else can. But anyway, you know what I'm going to mention? It's the cipher manuscript.
You want to know about the cipher manuscript.
What are they, John?
A hoax.
Mm.
Well, let me be a little more precise here. The cipher manuscripts are handwritten. They do exist. Copies of them are readily available these days, the originals, including apparently the original set. And the original stuff is written in a handwriting that and drawn in a style which appears to be the same as that of I'm going to forget his name now. One of the important occultists of the generation immediately before the Golden Dawnies. He was Kenneth Mackenzie. Kenneth Mackenzie. I just had to wrestle with the memory and get his name. The drawings in particular are done in an identical style as drawings that Mackenzie had for an old Oddfellows ritual that he had in his collection, which I actually published a version of years back. But yeah, so probably wherever it came from originally, the cipher manuscript was in Mackenzie's hands, and it may have been his idea. Mm. But that ended up in the hands of William Wynne Westcott. Westcott manufactured a very fine, colorful, late 19th century sort of occult fiction story about a mysterious German adept, Fräulein Anna Sprengel, who left her, who just happened to leave her contact information in this cipher manuscript. And of course, Westcott contacted her and immediately got back, sight unseen, this authorization to open a Golden Dawn temple in England, and blah, 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 and using the cipher manuscripts and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, Westcott is a secret chief, and Mathers and Woodman are secret chiefs, and away we go. Now, of course, the trope of finding a mysterious manuscript in a bookstall or something, which is I think what they ended up claiming. That was all over the potboiler occult literature at the time. I think one of Marie Corelli's books makes use of it. I know that a very similar theme is all over Bulwer Lytton's Zanoni. And it was absolutely standard. So I really question that anyone even believed it at the time, because it was
sorry.
No, because it's so obvious. Just it's very much as though you were to claim that a flying saucer had descended and handed you these mysterious silver scrolls. Everyone would be going, yeah, right.
But I mean, with that obviousness, which is I think is apparent with many other esotericists, as I mentioned, you have this sort of a little, you have enough charisma there to sort of carry it on. And do you think there is this sort of collective need for, we all want to be involved because this is interesting, but we need that initial, we can't fully accept as human beings that we have just created this out of whole cloth kind of thing, because then we'd be able to look at the code, so to speak. We need some sort of mystery, some drama to suspend, not necessarily disbelief, but we need to unconsciously feel that it isn't really just us.
Well, I think that your concept of suspending disbelief is very appropriate, because at that same time, remember, many of these same people were belonging to various fraternal orders that had their own, typically bogus, origin stories. I mean, I hope it will not shock any of my brother Masons out there in the world, but Masonry does not actually descend from King Solomon's temple. There's this whole whoop-de-doo about how, here's this tradition from King Solomon's temple, but very clearly that's not what happened. It's simply, it's an old builder's guild from the late Middle Ages that's been reworked for new purposes, and so on and so forth. And of course, there were plenty of orders in circulation at the same time that didn't even have that much of a claim. And I will hold the Druid orders, which were very active in Britain in the late 19th century, as a great example. Not one of them had the least connection to the ancient Druids. In many of them, it was very clear. One order whose old ritual I happen to have and have read in detail, claimed to have been founded by this wise ancient druid named Togodubaline. Togodubaline. Well, that's what happens when you take the name of Togodumnus, who's a Celt who shows up in Caesar, I think, and the name of Cymbeline, Shakespeare's character, and run them together. Okay, if this sounds bogus, I'm sure it did even more so back at the time when everybody knew Caesar and everybody knew Shakespeare. And yet they had this whole business about Togodubaline, the great druid. Suspension of disbelief does not mean blind credulity. It means we're going to play with this. We're going to have fun with it. We're going to accept this as the ground rule for the game we're playing and enjoy it. And if there's something useful involved in it, like, for example, whether it's a druid order that has, whether it's a charitable order or what have you, or if it's a Golden Dawn that has some very useful occult teachings, well, let's have fun.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Is just because on a sort of surface phenomenal, let's use a bit of fancy language, phenomenal level, we can say, we could do the deconstruction, say, look how bogus this is. We've got the manuscripts, we've done the handwriting analysis, it's obviously just this. On a sort of noumenal level, and I think the druid example is probably the key one, because with the ancient druids, was it 10 pages really we've got of, text on their history. But
grand total, and half of it contradicts the other half.
Exactly, but when you go through to the Druid Revival, what I was going to say is that in a noumenal sense, there is this current, right? It's still there's still a connection to that other thing, that, as you like to say, and as is coming back in fashion. These manuscripts had the vibes of something.
They have the vibe. They have the vibe. The Druid Revival took off because people found that playing the game, putting on the silly white robes, and going down to Stonehenge does something. It connects them somehow. And this is something that people are still experiencing now, and not necessarily all at Stonehenge. And in the same way, people got involved in the Golden Dawn because, they were used to the canned origin stories. Everybody has a canned origin story. But then they got the knowledge, like they went through the ceremony, they were going, wow, okay. Because, a lot of these people, especially of the first rounds of people to go through it, they knew a certain amount about the Kabbalah. They knew a certain amount about Western esotericism, about Hermeticism, and so on. And so they're going through this ritual and going, whoa, okay, this is cool. There's a lot of depth here. And then they're getting their knowledge lectures. They're going through further degrees. They're being asked to demonstrate their proficiency in various things. And very clearly, while there's a game, it's not just a game, or if you will, it's a game played very seriously. The alchemists were very into that. Michael Meyer, very important German alchemist in the early 17th century, wrote books with titles like Lusus Serious, a serious game, or Jocus Severus, a severe joke, where he would have these really silly stories. If I recall correctly, Lusus Serious is this long debate among the birds as to who is going to be king of the birds. And the owl is taking one role, and it's really quite funny. But there's a lot of alchemical tradition passed on to it, a lot of very insightful material in physical and spiritual alchemy in the terms of this silly narrative about birds. So the game can be a vehicle for something useful. It can be a vehicle for something very powerful. And yes, one can play the deconstructive role, but that's, okay, you've deconstructed it. Now put it back together again. We ask somebody to do that with a clock, and you'll have an interesting experience on your hands.
I'm going to assume it was the crow that became the king of the birds.
It has been long enough since I read that piece of Meyer, I don't remember who became the king of the birds.
Damn, I'll have to find it out. That sounds like a good story.
It's worth checking. I would wonder if it was the wren, because the wren very often ended up as the king of the birds.
Okay. So back to these manuscripts, they are full to the brim with Kabbalah, astrology, geomancy, alchemy, the grab bag of everything, really. So what makes the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as they are sort of organizing and structuring things, what makes them sort of just not a simple... Well, look, I think and I mean this in no cynical terms. I mean this in a positive sense when I say it. The history of occultism is a history of inventive plagiarism. And so
absolutely.
What makes this sort of, let's say, collation of all these things that they found, more than just someone saying we've just put a load of things together?
Okay. First of all, the first thing is that there's the old joke, you copy from one person, it's plagiarism. You copy from 10, it's research. You copy from 100, it's a genius. The Golden Dawn copied from hundreds. Mathers, in particular, he had a small income, and he spent all his time in the British Library, going through reams of old occult literature. And he had a very solid knowledge of the subject. Westcott was a lifelong occultist and Kabbalist. And so those two in particular, and then as the order got going, a range of others, they had probably half the really top-notch occult talent in England at the time. Meeting, once a month at Isis Urania Lodge, and working like beavers to come up with these, with a synthesis of magical tradition and inspired plagiarism, very inspired in their case. The second thing is that they also practiced it. Because it's one thing to come up with a neat collation of documents. It's another one to say, okay, I'm going to do these rituals for a year and see what happens. And it's when you actually do the work and test it and adapt it and say, I think we need to change that, and that really didn't work, but this is really good, so we should move it to a more central location, et cetera, et cetera. You get a lot out of that. They also had the advantage in terms of the ritual work that William Westcott himself, was an extremely experienced Freemason. He was involved in the Lodge of Emulation, which was the main London lodge that taught Masons how to do ritual. Westcott was heavily involved in that. And so he was simply an expert ritualist. and could go over the various draft rituals, both the solitary and the lodge rituals, and say, no, I don't think that's going to work. Why don't we try this instead? And here would be a nice little thing to add. And so you end up with rituals that are very dramatic and very functional, if rather fussy.
Mm.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm. So all of this comes together to make the Golden Dawn a really brilliant collation, and in fact a summary of an immense share of the total body of Western esotericism, more I think than anybody else has put together into a single system. Go on.
Well, I was about to say, because you know this notion of doing the work is of course though people always want to ignore it, you know. It's the key thing. Which book should I read? Which book should I read? Well, what about the one where you actually do it? It brings to mind a question I probably should have brought in earlier. We're talking very late 19th century here. What is the occult atmosphere like? You know, is there anything remotely like this around? You know, the sort of coherent, structured group. Freemasons, of course, but as a much greater, you know, is there any new upcoming groups or anything like what is the atmosphere like at the time?
Okay. It was a bubbling cauldron of new groups. We had Freemasonry, of course, and we had various Masons who were all going, oh, this is very well and good, but how about we do something a little more esoteric, a little more occult? In France, you could get away with almost anything because they didn't have a coherent Grand Lodge structure. In England, you had to keep Grand Lodge from getting too upset, but there was a lot of room for people within the Masonic community to tinker with things. There were a lot of slightly older traditions being brought over. You had stuff going on at the same time in Paris. And that was an even hotter hotbed of occultism at the time. And so you had various organizations being founded. You had various lodges and temples and societies being organized to do this kind of ritual work, each of them coming up with something of their own. Mackenzie, who I mentioned earlier, was involved in several of these. Westcott, of course. Westcott had his fingers in every esoteric pie in England. And so you had all of these organizations. You had especially the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, which was founded in 1868 by a bunch of Masons who were interested in Rosicrucian symbolism, and had its own system of initiation, which was somewhat similar to the Golden Dawn system. They just didn't have the practical dimension. But that was really the test bed, because Mathers and Westcott were both heavily involved in that. They had a clear sense of what could be done with initiation ritual in that setting, and so they said, okay, we're going to take something outside of the Masonic setting. We are going to open it to women as well as men, to non-Masons as well as Masons, and we're going to have practical work. And once they did that, of course, people who belonged to all of these other groups were going, oh yeah? Because many of those didn't have much in the way of practical work. That was partly because of Theosophy. The Theosophical Society was very much into occult theory, and they thought it was absolutely great that everyone should sit and pick their way through reams and reams of theosophical literature and meditate a little. Full stop. End of sentence. Blavatsky herself was very down on occult practice, and her followers, her successors, picked up and ran with it, and they were equally down on doing the practical stuff. And so you had a fair number of organizations that kind of tiptoed into the practice. You had one, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which was very deeply into practical work, and it might have gone someplace except it crashed and burned in its own way in the early 1870s. And then, then there was Golden Dawn. And then there was this semi-secret organization that everyone knew about that was actually passing on serious practical stuff. And so there was a stampede to join the Golden Dawn, and all of these people who had plenty of experience with these other things ended up in the Golden Dawn. So that was another very important reason why it took off the way it did.
It's probably something that's only really a name that's only really known to those interested in alternative spirituality today. But in the day, was it known as a public thing? Maybe something people just, I've heard of that.
Well, you either had to know somebody, or you had to be paying attention to little places. The Golden Dawn, Westcott put a squib here and there into like notes and queries, just making a passing reference to it. But generally, you had to know somebody. But the occult community at the time in England was, of course, it's a small country. Everybody knew everybody else. And so if you were involved in occultism, you probably belonged to the local Theosophical group. You went to lectures in London or elsewhere, depending on what you could get to. You knew people. And so probably you'd be sitting in the Theosophical library or in a coffee shop just down the road, talking with somebody you'd met. And you met a couple of times at a Theosophical event, and somebody would say, "Are you potentially interested in something a little more practical than this?" And that was how they did it.
I was about to say, actually, because the sort of, I don't want to say downfall, but the complete drop off of interest in Theosophy at a certain point, considering how absolutely huge it was. Do you think this has something to do with it? This sort of rise? Do you want to actually come do something?
No, it was that was a different. There were a vast number of people then, now, at every other time who very much enjoy sitting in a comfortable chair reading all about occultism. It's very popular. I won't complain about it too much because it helps pay my bills. All of us writers, we depend on such people to provide us with royalties. But no, Theosophy's death was self-inflicted. We can get into the story, but it destroyed itself very efficiently, and I hope it can manage to recover at some point. But it's been creeping along in a very small way ever since. Do you want me to cover the story?
We can add it in. I think maybe it's sort of it's around this sort of same. These are two huge. If we were to pick the two most influential groups, these are the two.
In the English-speaking world, yes, Theosophy and the Golden Dawn are it. Okay, it's very simple. After Blavatsky died, of course, power in the Theosophical Society transferred to Annie Besant. And she was nothing like as skillful a manager or politician or organizer as Blavatsky had been. And there were quarrels, and various people started splitting off and doing their own things, not least because Besant was very much into protecting people that she favored, and that meant Charles Leadbeater, who had a little problem with young boys. And so when that came out, as of course it did, and Besant covered for him, well, that's when that was when Rudolf Steiner split off and took half of European Theosophy with him. That was when G.R.S. Mead split off and formed the Quest Society. It's when William Quan Judge split off to form his rival Theosophical Lodge, and so on. So there was that. And then as things got more and more heated, and as the 1920s built on, Besant became convinced that Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was the son of a servant at the Theosophical headquarters outside of Mumbai, was the Messiah, was the next world teacher, and had him raised with all of this training. And then it was in 1929. In the United States, as I recall, they had this big grand meeting of the Order of the Star in the East, the organization she'd founded to support his claims to messiahship. And Krishnamurti, in an act of impressive personal courage, got up in front of this immense worshipping mob and said, "You're wrong. I'm not here to teach you. You can't learn anything that matters from anybody but yourself. Truth is a pathless land. I'm dissolving. I dissolve the Order of the Star in the East. I renounce any claim to messiahhood. Go away." And the fiasco, of course, caused an enormous drop-off in interest in Theosophy because Besant and the organization had piled so much credibility onto their claims around that. And then shortly thereafter, a matter of like a couple of months thereafter, the stock market collapsed. Theosophy had at that point a very substantial upper middle class membership. It had a lot of money, a lot of people who were involved in stocks, heavily over their head in the market, lost everything. And so the order suffered immense financial losses, huge numbers of people quit, and they never got over it.
What happened to
the morals to the
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the morals to this story, just before we go on, are first of all, if you're going to promote somebody as the Messiah, make sure that they'll go along with it. And second, don't make yourself dependent on the financial stability of a class of crazed speculators when the market is at all-time highs. So I offer that to the benefit of anybody out there who might be interested in founding a mass occult movement. Just keep those in mind. Okay, go on.
So, well, that in a strange way, that was really a discussion. That was a chat about schism, right? And it was actually a question I wanted to bring in earlier, but because this also happens in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, I noticed there's one called the Orthodox Order of, like quite literally like what's the film Life of Brian, right?
Yes, the Judean People's Front,
exactly.
The People's Front of Judea, the popular Judean Front. Yes, exactly. We do that in Druidry, by the way. Also, the Ancient Order of Druids in America is unrelated to the Ancient Order of Druids, and neither one has anything to do with the Ancient Druid Order. I'm not making this up, I promise you. Go on.
Well, I think every single esoteric group or any spiritual group that gets to a sufficient size or has a sufficient history, usually, of course, if there is a guru, Gurdjieff or a Blavatsky or whoever, it's usually after their death. I've never seen a big split prior. Are these splits, these schisms, primarily, should we say, charismatic infighting, or is there other reasons?
Well, it really varies from case to case because there are so many good reasons to schism, and as well as so many bad reasons. First of all, of course, if you have a charismatic leader and that whom everyone accepts, and the charismatic leader dies, unless the charismatic leader has already chosen a successor, and the successor is equally charismatic, you're almost certainly going to have schisms at that point, because half a dozen other people are going to say, well, that's all very well and good, dear, but I feel that I should be the leader. And away we go. You also have honest differences of opinion. Very often, by the time the charismatic leader dies, there are half a dozen people who are saying, no, this is the way we ought to go, or that way or the other way. And so they end up schisming over issues of doctrine. In the case of the Golden Dawn, everything in its mother-in-law has been involved. The original Golden Dawn blew itself into 3 different pieces in 1903. And then the pieces started blowing themselves apart, and then they gradually went under one at a time. Fast forward to the 1970s, a cheap, readily available edition of Rigardi's book, The Golden Dawn, became readily available, and immediately people started popping their own Golden Dawn orders. Some of them claimed, usually bogus, inheritance from the original Golden Dawn. Most of them just made it up, or did the traditional thing and invented a secret chief somewhere. It really doesn't matter, because the rituals work whether you have an official connection or not, whatever your story is. And so you end up with all of these different Golden Dawn groups that are typically unrelated to each other, and I see that as actually healthy, because it keeps the dysfunctions of one leader from tainting the whole organization.
So to stick with the Golden Dawn, to get into the nitty-gritty, I mean, I guess in a way, my question would be to jump back to your first ever book. I believe it's your first ever book, Inside a Magical Lodge. Because you have a long history with the Golden Dawn, which perhaps you can give us in brief. But let's say, of course, I don't expect you to reveal the great secrets of the secret chiefs, who, of course, you've met them all. If you want to open the doors to the Golden Dawn Lodge and set foot inside, this is really the question on many people's minds, I think, when they think of occultism. What is it? What is happening? What is the atmosphere like? What is? What
Okay.
do you? Yeah. What
Okay.
is that engagement like?
Okay, I think I'll take you up on the offer and just do a very brief run through of my own experience with the Golden Dawn, because that will actually give some idea of how this happened. I didn't get involved in the Golden Dawn as an organization until quite late in my career. I got involved in it as a tradition, as something I learned about in books. Starting in the winter of 1976, 1977, I'm not exactly sure which side of the new year was on, picking up a cheap, lurid paperback copy of Techniques of High Magic by Francis King and Stephen Skinner in a department store in Seattle, Washington, $1.95. I thought I'd found the Holy Grail. I was a kid at the time.
To be fair, to start with Stephen Skinner, though, it's not. You can't really go. That's not too bad of a start.
Certainly, no. It was or Francis King. I mean, it's as an introductory book at that time, it was the best thing in print. There are other books, including some of mine, that I think are, have built on that and gone a little further, but it was a great place to start. So I had that. I had W.E. Butler's book, The Magician, His Training and Work, and a couple of other things that I was able to find. And that was what I had to go on. Then, later on, and I just was going, wow, this is what I've always wanted. This is what I've been looking for, all of my very brief life. I was like 14, 15 years old at the time. And so I was just incredibly over the moon about this. Now, it was Golden Dawn magic because that was almost all you could get in those days in the United States. People talk about the British invasion in terms of music, the various British bands that came over in the wake of the Beatles. We had a British invasion in occultism also. And so there was a long period in the latter part of the 20th century where if it wasn't the Golden Dawn, and it wasn't Dion Fortune, it wasn't Aleister Crowley, and it wasn't the Wicca, Gerald Gardner's version of Wicca. If it hadn't been invented in England between 1887 and whenever Gerald Gardner finished forging the first version of the Book of Shadows, it didn't exist. People were completely unaware of it. Magic came from England. That was the sort of generic American idea in those days. Wicca never really turned my crank. It never interested me at all. Aleister Crowley, I read some of and kind of chuckled because I knew people like him, and took the book back to the library and didn't check it out again. The Golden Dawn was of interest, and that was what I focused on. And over the years thereafter, I was able to gradually build up a fair collection of that and of Dion Fortune material, which influenced that. But years passed. I had published 2 books. No, I had published 4 books before I first was in contact with anybody doing Golden Dawn magic who wasn't part of my little local circle of people in Seattle. And I had this was we're talking more than 20 years after I had originally encountered this material, and so I'd done an enormous amount of work with it. And so I gradually discovered that there was in fact a whole world of people out there who were practicing Golden Dawn magic, and who some of them were getting good results of it, some of them were getting very poor results. Eventually, I went through in various groups. I went through Golden Dawn degrees and all this kind of stuff. It's very difficult to explain the atmosphere, the vibe of an esoteric lodge to somebody who hasn't been in one, because it is a very odd state. It's not particularly spooky. There are no tentacles writhing up from the corners or anything like that, nor is Satan and all his minions gathering around with the flapping of leathery wings or anything like this. There is a sense of being in 2 places at once. And one of the places is typically, a dusty rental hall somewhere, or whatever you have for your place, and the material objects you're working with. And the Golden Dawn system is extremely high on clutter. You can tell it's a Victorian system. It has plenty of bric-a-brac and knickknacks and gingerbread this and fancy that. In fact, most of the groups that spun off from the Golden Dawn, one of the major things they did was decrease the total amount of hardware. And getting those in any quality is a difficult thing. And so typically you have, to some degree, makeshift stuff. You have the hand painted this and the inexpensive cotton that, and so it has this kind of school pageant quality to it on the physical level. And there's this, but while you're at work, there is this sense of something else, something more complete, something more gorgeous, something more real that is kind of trying to come through. It's a little as though you were at some kind of Tolkien fan convention, okay? And there's everyone dressed up like, the children are dressed up like hobbits, and the adults are dressed up like elves or Dunedain or soldiers of Gondor or what have you. And all the time, there's this unnerving sense that Gandalf might actually be in the room somewhere. I mean, the real Gandalf, not that there's something real that's trying to be born, and that can, if everything works right, can come through with enough power to change your life. And so that's very much that I think that's probably the best way I could describe what it's like to be inside a magical lodge. And the funny thing is, even when the quality of the knickknacks and the bric-a-brac don't actually make that much difference. You can be doing it with lemons cut out of cardboard, and if everyone's really concentrating, really doing the inner work and this kind of stuff, there you are in a place that is not made with hands. And there are angelic powers in the four quarters, and it really starts to hum. But you can't guarantee that. That's what you're trying to achieve. And a good temple, a good lodge, will achieve that far more often than not.
You're trying to achieve it. What is it to? Let's allow me
to bring through the non-physical into the physical, to bring through the unseen into the seen, to bring through the spiritual energies into material manifestation, at least for long enough to initiate somebody, to assist them in rising to a higher level of consciousness.
What is it to respect that? Because I think that's the question of the day regarding why some religions are just, I think of, and I get annoyed at myself because technically it's my heritage, but when I look at the Church of England, ultimately there's nothing there, and the question I think is of a respect for the sacred, right? And I think it's a big question. What is it to, that as you said, being two places at once? Yeah, we're in a dusty church hall or a town hall or whatever it might be, but something else is happening, and I think that comes from a certain respect, or a certain.
That's part of it. That's part of it. First of all, you have to be open to the idea that there is this other thing that's trying to come through. If it's just, and here, if we want to talk about the Church of England or most mainstream churches here in the United States, a lot of the problem is the education they get. They get an ordinary university education, which is very agnostic, very aspiritual. They don't necessarily get any training in things like prayer and contemplation and the various other tools that one uses in a religious setting to bring through that sense of the other. In fact, it's discouraged. They're just supposed to be, functionaries, bureaucrats, people who go through these little ceremonies on Sunday because that's what you do, and it's really sad because those same ceremonies can be used to bring through an enormous amount of power. If you read power, energy, life, force, it's not just a kind of it's not this kind of cute, quaint, well-behaved little thing. We're talking about the forces that bring the world into being. Ultimately, there's a great passage in C.S. Lewis in That Hideous Strength, where one of the characters has a religious experience. And it occurs to her in that moment that all this while she's thought of spirit as this sort of meek, well-behaved thing that you sort of float up to like a vapor. And what she's actually experiencing is strong hands reaching down to make or destroy. And so that's. I think we have far too many people, as I think Lewis would have agreed, far too many people who, if they understand that there's anything spiritual, oh yeah, it's this meek, well-behaved thing waiting for you to ascend in a puff of vapor. That it might be powerful, that it might be alive, that it might have its own will, its own intentions, its own purpose, with which you are expected to align yourself as the price of participating in it. That's nothing that you'll get in the training of your modern day Church of England pastor.
With regards to participation, we can't really do the full thing here, of course, because if one wants to know why, go look at the size of the big green book, as it's known. But the Golden Dawn curriculum, what does that sort of what does that participation look like?
Okay, you're said. Okay, here you are. You are now. You've just been through the neophyte ceremony. You are dazed and confused. You have no idea what you've experienced, and now the cancellarius or somebody, or the premonstrator, perhaps one of the officers of the temple, is coming out and is instructing you in what you're going to do now. And here we're going to hand out these papers. You're going to be setting aside half an hour a day. During that half an hour a day, you are going to be doing a simple ritual, the lesser ritual of the pentagram. And then you will be doing a meditation, and you will be starting to learn how to do divination. And no, that is not the same thing as fortune telling. It is a practice to develop your intuition. And oh yes, here's a bunch of stuff you also have to study. Okay, so, and then if you do that, and some people do, I say some people do, because normally at least half of the people that come in that way go out the same door they went in. They have had a ceremony. They're not interested in doing the work. They're not willing to do the work, and so they drift right back out again. But we'll assume that you assume you're not one of those people, that you really were moved by a desire to actually experience magic. You're willing to put aside half an hour a day, set the alarm a little early every morning, and get up and do your practices. Okay, so you go through another initiation ritual a month later. Okay, here's another packet. You're still doing the lesser ritual of the pentagram. You're still doing the meditation. Here's some new stuff to meditate on. Here's some more stuff to study. Rinse and repeat as you go through the different grades. Each time you're getting more symbols, more material to study, more things to meditate on. The practices are beginning to expand. At a certain point, you get expansions to the pentagram ritual. And then comes the day, a minimum of 2 years after you get started, you receive the Adeptus Minor grade, the first of the inner order grades. And that is a four-alarm fire of a ceremony. It's extremely complicated, intricate, and gorgeous. And after that, the premonstrator comes, or actually at that point it's the chief adept, because it's inner order. It sits you down and says, well, now you've done all the preliminary stuff, and here, out comes a notebook that's about 3 inches thick. Whump! This is for you to work through at your own pace. And you open it and you find that it's packed to the bursting point with formulae of practical magic and divination and clairvoyance and all kinds of other occult practices. But you're not being spoon-fed anymore. You have been spoon-fed. You've been through the various degrees. And oh, by the way, would you mind training so you can getting to work so you can take a part in doing this or that ritual? We'd like you to memorize these lines, and away we go.
Mm-hmm. What's happening to you through those stages?
What's happening to you? Okay, well, that depends. Because this is not like interchangeable parts going through a factory. These are human souls we're dealing with here, and every one of them is different. But broadly speaking, you are developing will and imagination. You are instead of just sort of drifting through life, you're reaching the point of realizing that you can choose what you want in life. You can make things happen, and there are ways to make things happen that are not necessarily obvious or visible or dependent on a strict materialism. You're developing your capacity to perceive things. And again, these may not be things that fit within a clear sort of narrow-minded materialism, but you're learning to perceive and sense the unseen. You're developing your imagination. We think, oh, the imagination, it's just imaginary. That is the single most important power we have as human beings. We literally construct the world we live in by using our imagination to piece together the data of the senses. We simply don't notice it. We do it so quickly. Because that's the case, we often don't notice when we've woven in, for example, misjudgments and emotional hang-ups and burdensome feelings from childhood and all kinds of things like that woven into these things, and that's why our lives suck. And when you have mastered your imagination and will and the intuitive perceptions and some of the other things you learn in magic, you can change that. You can say, why am I treating every interaction with another person as though this person is going to bully me? Because they're not. And I've been feeling, since I was 3 years old, I've been doing that, and and all these kinds of bad problems have been happening. Okay, I'm going to stop, and away we go. So that's the kind of thing that can happen now. The Golden Dawn is fairly high intensity, and one of the problems with any high intensity training program is that it also has failures. And the failure system, the mark of the failure in the Golden Dawn, on the one hand, you have the people who get into it and run. They just, whether they take the neophyte grade or they take a couple other grades, and they run into something that suddenly convinces them, oh crap, this is real, and they're out the door.
But that's a good.
That's one class
a good thing, though, right? That should, in a way, that should happen.
Well, yes, but the thing is, if they were brought into it more gently, they would be going, oh, this is real, and then you calm them down and give them a cup of tea and talk through it, and eventually, again, if you're doing it more gently, they aren't necessarily going to panic. It's the other kind of failure that's the disastrous kind, because all this stuff can go to your head and feed your ego. And so you get a certain number of people who go through the Golden Dawn system. About the time they hit the Adeptus Minor, which has a lot of solar symbolism, their ego inflates to colossal size. And then immediately they start picking fights with everyone else because they're convinced they are the enlightened ones. They are the ones who have received the true word of the eon, or whatever it is that they're into. And that's where you get the Aleister Crowleys and people and many others who could be named, for whom it's all about them. They are it's sad. But that's the other problem that you get with Golden. And one of the reasons that Dion Fortune, for example, and many of the other Golden Dawn sort of offshoot orders ditched certain aspects of the Golden Dawn degree rituals or grade rituals and rewrote them or simply replaced them, is to take that risk down several notches and produce fewer egomaniacs.
Well,
because that was a problem with the Golden Dawn. Go on.
Well, there's an abstract question from that. There's a book I'm fond of, which is just a question and answer session with a chap called Lord Pentland, who was a student of Gurdjieff, one of the more developed students, shall we say. But every other answer he gives is pretty much, I don't know, you'll have to find out for yourself. And it brings, what you spoke about there, one might be mistaken in thinking that this process, and I think the notion of grades, especially from the very quantified Western mind, this notion of aggrandizement, of adding. But would you say through this process that actually what's more important is that these processes teach you or show you what to shed, what you've added that you need to get rid of, and that's actually more important?
I don't know that it's more important, but it's certainly equally important. And also, Rudolf Steiner had a very important point, which is the one of the basic requirements for any kind of spiritual development is the ability to recognize that something is greater than you are. You have to have that capacity of respect, that capacity of adoration, of admiration. Or because if you can't conceive of anything better than you are now, you cannot achieve anything better than you are now. So that's something that also, I think, a well-designed course of medical training is always going to include that focus on recognizing that you are not, all that in a bag of chips. You are not even when you have been, received the ornate funny hat that makes you the grand panjandrum of the purple horde of the glimmering tower of Bleh, or what have you. That doesn't, you're still just a human being. You may be a human being who knows a little more than some others and has some skills that some others don't have, but you are not that big of a deal in the great scheme of things. And so relax and get off your high horse.
So what are grades then?
Grades are very much at the moment. I don't recall what you call them in England, but it's very much like the grades in our public schools, where our public schools are not public like your public schools. You first grade, second grade, third grade, and so on, where each one is a year of study, and you're expected to master certain things during that process. And and each one of them has a ritual, which represents, it's the initiation ritual. And the word initiation means beginning, okay? It introduces you to certain symbols and certain energies that you'll be working with over the course of that grade. And so most esoteric schools, not all by any means, but most, have a series of grades that you work through simply because it's a lot easier than dumping everything on you all at once.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we need that as Westerns?
The thing is, it's not just Western. You often have the grade qua grade is not always part of Eastern systems, but a lot of esoteric Buddhism, for example, is they divide up the training into various steps, and you will be assigned, you will do this set of meditations for a year or for 108 days or what have you, and you'll study these texts, and you'll go on, and then there's another kind of meditation, and you'll begin working at uniting yourself with this bodhisattva, blah, blah, blah. So it's very much the same principle of working through a graded system of study. And I think that's almost essential anytime you're dealing with any kind of complex body of lore and practice. If you want to learn to be an electrical engineer, you start at the beginning, and you learn, and then you go step by step until you actually, can do the work of an electrical engineer. It's the same kind of thing.
Is there anything you'd like to add about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn that you feel is key that we haven't added in?
Let's see. Mostly, the thing about the Golden Dawn, it's not the only game in town, and some of its members have tended to treat it as though it was. There are actually many different traditions of esoteric study and practice out there in the Western tradition. The Golden Dawn is certainly one of them, and it's certainly valid. It works. It has enormous potential. It has to be taken seriously, and it has to be done completely. One of the other things I've noticed in terms of people who will take up the Golden Dawn and study it for a couple of years and then go, well, this isn't working, it's because they're only doing the stuff that interests them. They're not doing it as a complete system. It is a complete system. You actually have to do the meditations. You actually have to do all the other work, or you're not going to get far. I've rather harped on this in some of my books on the subject, but really, it was an enormously useful thing at the time. It was revolutionary when it first came out. It was revolutionary when the Regardie's book was published in the late 1930s, and when it came out again in the 1970s. There were increasingly, we're getting more information on some of the other systems of the same time earlier and later. We're seeing a lot more interest in Martinism, for example, these days. We're seeing a lot more interest in some of the Central European systems. And I think it's certainly an option. It's not the only game in town. I hope that eventually, maybe a century from now, there will be some new synthesis that includes the best elements of the Golden Dawn and the best elements of some of these other things.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, but I was going to ask, where do we see the Golden Dawn's influence today? But really, that's why we're talking about them, right?
Exactly.
You'd be hard-pressed to find a Western group that didn't at least have some connection, at least.
That's less true now than it used to be. Because for a very long time, it was the Golden Dawn, or was the Golden Dawn focused through Dion Fortune, the Golden Dawn focused through Aleister Crowley, the Golden Dawn focused through Wicca through Aleister Crowley, and so on and so forth. Since of course Gerald Gardner was a student of Crowley's, and or a few other, Paul Foster Case or what have you. Again, at this point, we're increasingly seeing the emergence on a larger scale of traditions that have much less influence, or in some cases, as again is Martinism, no influence at all, that came about in the same time or simply weren't part of that cultural milieu. And I think it's a good thing, because the Golden Dawn was a really useful thing again in its time. It still has a lot to teach, but it's not the only option. And I think to answer your question a little more straightforwardly, I think that over the years to come, what we're going to see is more people taking the Golden Dawn material and taking some of the other things and coming up with creative syntheses with them, and that's going to be the cutting edge of magic for a while. So
that's good. Where do you advise people to begin with the Golden Dawn? I know you've written. Is it like a 3-book series? I think.
Basically. What I would advise, I co-wrote with my late wife and another person a book called Learning Ritual Magic, which it was intended to be a 9-month training program for a little magical lodge the three of us ran at one point. And it has remained in print ever since we published it, simply because a lot of people find it to be the best simple introduction to Golden Dawn magic on your own. And so learning ritual magic is a good place to start. Then if you want to go on, my books, Paths of Wisdom and Circles of Power, deal with the theory and practice of Golden Dawn magic. And then you go on to Israel Regardie's big book. And away you go. That's a 10 to 20 year project, by the way. And this is not, to actually master the Golden Dawn work, it requires about as much work as it required to get a doctorate degree from university.
Okay. Well, but listeners, bear that in mind. But then again, I think that you mentioned before about how one of your first teachers said to you, and I think it is the most important thing for anyone really getting involved in such a thing, is not only to say, look, this is going to take 10, 20, if not more years, but really to say, look, the end isn't really. Don't focus on that, otherwise you are just going to be disappointed.
No. Yeah, exactly. This is going to take you the rest of your life, but you have the rest of your life. So why not? If you feel drawn to this, if you feel that this is a path you want to walk, it has enormous benefits. And those benefits don't wait until, you become the Grand Panjandrum of the Purple Tower or what have you.
What are you working on now?
Let's see. I'm just finishing up a translation from Latin of one of John Dee's neglected books on astrological magic and astrology. And I should say translation and commentary, because it badly needs commentary in the just so that modern people can use it. That needs a little more work. Dee has been an on and off interest of mine for a long time, but I decided it was time, partly because I do Latin translation the way some people do crosswords, and with some of the things going on in my life, I kind of needed the relaxation. And so I did the Propedeutica Aphoristica, Aphorisms on Astrology and Magic is the working title I'm using, and realized that this neglected book, one of John Dee's first serious publication, in fact, actually gives important keys to his very famous book, The Monas Hieroglyphica, which had been completely neglected because people haven't paid attention to this earlier work. So I'm doing a lot of stuff with John Dee right now.
Okay. Well, seems like a good place to finish up. I'll be sure to put the links for your Golden Dawn books in the description below and for your blog. But yeah, John Michael Greer, once again, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me on.